All right, guys, Sean Ray here for Sean Ray TV. We're going to talk about the history of the Mr. Olympia Championships. And we're going to start at the very beginning with the 54th anniversary of the Mr. Olympia coming up in Las Vegas this weekend. Let's start at the beginning in 1965, where we saw Larry the Legend Scott walk off with the 65 and 66 championships. He said he got out of bodybuilding and off the Mr. Olympia stage because he saw the Cuban, Sergio Oliva, coming by way of Cuba, winning the 67, 68, and 69 Mr. Olympia championships before he gave way to a young upstart by the name of Arnold Schwarzenegger by way of Austria. Arnold would not only go on to win the 1970 Mr. Olympia, but he'd knock off another 4 in a row, winning in 1971, 72, 73, 74, and 75. So I should say 5 more titles, which he would go into Hollywood after that. And his training partner, Franco Columbu, would win in 1976. Leaving the door open for the classic physique, Frank Zane. Frank Zane, weighing a whopping 180 pounds, would go on to win the 77, 78, and 79 Mr. Olympia titles before the Austrian Oak would make a comeback while making the movie Conan the Barbarian. In 1980, he would travel all the way to Australia, where many said this was a controversial victory for Arnold, but I saw it as a hands-down slam dunk victory. Many of the fans and historians of the sport forget that it was a Chris Dickerson at a mere 5'6" that was second place, and Mike Mincer, who was making all the noise, wound up in 5th. Arnold, even on an off day in that lineup, was able to hold off a lot of good cagey bodybuilders, including Frank Zane, Mike Mincer, Chris Dickerson, and a few other heavy hitters that were in the game, but just didn't hold the candle to the Austrian Oak. He was head and shoulders above the competition. While his legs were down and he wasn't as good as he was, he still had the genetics and enough muscle on his frame to pull out the victory, in my opinion, unanimously. And in 1981, Arnold would move aside and leave the door open for another controversial victory in the name of his training partner, Franco Columbu, who would win his second Mr. Olympia title. Now, a lot of people thought that the Golden Eagle, Tom Platz, was going to win this show, or maybe even Danny Padilla. But it was all for naught, as we saw Franco Columbu walk off with victory number 2. And in 1982, the sport would see its oldest Mr. Olympia champion in the form of Chris Dickerson. Chris Dickerson, at 5'6", and I believe he was 42 or 43 years old at the time, would walk off with the 1982 Mr. Olympia title and then give way to the 1983 champion from Lebanon, the Lion, Samir Bannout. Samir Bannout had a few shots at the title prior to that, but just couldn't get the water out of his system and dry up hard enough. But in 1983, Samir Bannout would arrive. That would be the year I would take up weight training, and he'd win his Mr. Olympia, his one and only Mr. Olympia title, which, as it proves, you only have to win one, because there's only been 13 champions in 53 years, and Samir is immortalized in the annals of Olympia champions. And in 1984, Lee Haney, the year I would graduate high school, would win the first of 8 Olympia titles in succession. From 84 till 1991, Lee Haney would hold on to that title and be challenged only a couple of times by guys half his size. Muhammad Makaway, a 2-time first Olympia runner-up in 83 and 84. You had Lee Labrada, who in 1989 and 1990 would challenge Lee Haney for second place. And of course, in 91, Lee Haney would retire from the sport for good and give way to the Shadow, Dorian Yates, who in 1992 would win the first of his 6 Olympia Sandow titles before he retired due to injury in 1997. And in 1998, the Olympia was wide open for many Hall of Fame bodybuilders, but we would see Ronnie, the Big Nasty, Coleman, by way of Texas, leapfrog over all those Hall of Fame bodybuilders to rattle off and tie 8 titles in a row, tying Mr. Lee Haney for 8 Sandow trophies, eclipsing Arnold Schwarzenegger by his number 7. And Ronnie Coleman, like many of the champions before him, Ronnie Coleman would actually be upset. He would be knocked off his throne. Lee Haney, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Dorian Yates were undefeated in terms of getting out of this sport of bodybuilding unscathed, whereas Ronnie Coleman would stick around and get beat by his nemesis, who was at the time a 5-time first Olympia runner-up and a 3-time Arnold Classic champion in the form of Jay Cutler. Jay Cutler would ultimately knock Ronnie Coleman off the title and hold on to it for a couple of years before Dexter the Blade Jackson in 2008 would wrestle it away from Jay Cutler. But Jay Cutler, being the only Mr. Olympia to lose the title, win the title, and regain the title. Jay Cutler would regain the title in 2009 before he would then be upset by the reigning and defending champion, Phil Heath. Phil Heath would knock off his mentor in the name of Jay Cutler, who would win 4 titles before he retired. And then Phil Heath would hold on, and he's rattled off 7 consecutive titles, rounding out our 53 years. This is our 54th year. Phil Heath is in the driver's seat, going for a record-tying number 8. He's an odds-on favorite to win it for an 8th consecutive year. And last year he was challenged slightly by Big Ramy, but this year it seems that Phil Heath's strategy is to streamline his physique, come in with better conditioning, and if those things come to fruition injury-free, Phil Heath will more than likely tie Lee Haney and Ronnie Coleman for 8 consecutive titles at that Olympia show. There you have the history of the Mr. Olympia. History could be rewritten this weekend if Phil Heath gets knocked off his pedestal and we are to see a 14th Olympia champion. It remains to be proven, and we'll be right back here at Sean Ray TV with all the highlights, interviews, and information about the 54th annual Joe Weider Olympia weekend from Las Vegas. I'm Sean Ray.